957-2874, on Twitter at David Webb Show. I want to go back to something I played earlier and bring in our guest, Dr. Bill Parker from the East-West Institute. Cut 4, Nancy Pelosi.
It takes preparation, which the president didn't make. It's clear he didn't know what he was getting into, and now he's walking away from it in this very chummy, palsy-walsy letter.
Dr. Bill Parker, COO of the East-West Institute, former naval commander, former chief of war plans at the Pentagon, joins me. Now, the East-West Institute, and I want to put this in context, and Bill, great to have you back on the show. You are engaged as an institute now for decades around the world in these high-level circumstances, let's call it that, negotiations, discussions, trying to resolve conflicts, trying to prevent conflicts. In doing so, there's a fair amount of behind-the-scenes and work done prior to major meetings. Can you talk about that process just a little bit and add to that what really happened before this canceled meeting with North Korea?
David, first, it's great to be back on your show again. I will start with saying that, yes, East-West Institute, based in New York City, but we have offices in Moscow and Brussels. We work out of Istanbul. We work around the world, San Francisco. The reality is that what we do is conflict prevention, full stop. And when you look at the conflict prevention efforts that we do, much of them are working with countries, non-state actors, et cetera, behind the scenes that will never go public. And I'm not going to go public today with much of that either. But what we do is we try to set the scene for countries or other entities when they meet to have a successful evolution. And sometimes that takes years or even a decade to get to that point, and other times it's very short. But the reality is setting the scene so that those final decision makers, normally governments, can get to the point where they have a successful end game.
And the reason I asked that, Bill, is because as I walked the audience through in the last segment, there was what would be called the normal plan in sequence. Advanced teams put in place, conversations. Secretary Pompeo made 2 trips to Pyongyang. Our teams, our advanced team lead with a team went to Singapore, and the North Koreans didn't show up. It's vastly different from what's been reported in much of the media today, and I want to correct the record. And having someone like you who understands and that process, I don't want you to reveal anything, obviously, but the process that's involved here, it's extremely important that we be upfront and honest about it.
Yeah, if you're going to do this process correctly, and you're serious about it, and this administration is very serious about it. I've said this before. They're using all of the instruments of national power, from diplomatic to information to military to economic, financial, intelligence, and law enforcement. They're using all of that. And when you look at the seriousness of this organization, they are not going to reveal everything that they're doing behind the scenes to the public, nor should they. And they're also, in some cases, not revealing everything to other political figures who have the habit of leaking things for their own benefit and not for that of the country. So when I hear other politicians out there stating that certain preparations were not made, it's a little frustrating because they know very well that there has been a significant effort in this case to get this meeting together. But it's also important to realize that this meeting is not the end game. And there's too many people that are stating that it is, that the end goal is to have the meeting. No, the end goal is to denuclearize, if you want to use that term, to denuclearize the peninsula. And so that's the real end game. It's not this meeting. This meeting is just one part of that.
So let's talk about some of the things that are possible, as you see it, possible with moving, shall we say, forward with North Korea. Denuclearization is the word, not just a buzzword, but a goal that is stated. But stabilization is a big part of this, stabilization on the peninsula. So looking at stabilizing maybe it's the relationship, the actions, and the fact that we do have unstable responses from North Korea at times. Where do you see us going next, or where it's possible?
Yeah, so David, I think there's kind of three steps over a decade or a couple decade process. First is stabilization, and I'll talk about that in a second. The second is democracy, and then the third is unification. And I think it's important that they go in that order. So when we talk stabilization, we're talking first remove the nuclear weapons so that there's not an inadvertent event that occurs. And then once you remove those, start to stabilize the relationship between the countries in the region, as well as the United States and North Korea and many others. You will also then have the opportunity to stabilize because you will have shown a good intent. You will be able to then help stabilize the economy because, as we've talked about before, the North Koreans are just starving to death over there. And if you just give them money in the current situation, then the very wealthy get even wealthier and the rest continue to starve to death. So we don't want that to happen. And then you get into democracy, which will take probably a decade, maybe even a full generation. Once the democracy is set, then, and I'm talking about a full functioning democracy, then looking at unification possibly makes sense, and that would make them a very large economy down the road because you have the 25 million in North Korea to the north, and you have the technology and a very successful South Korea to the south. Finally, I would look at the relationship. If you go back and you look at East and West Germany, where West Germany had an economy that was 7 times larger than East Germany's, and compare that with North and South Korea, South Korea's economy is 40 times larger and stronger than North Korea's. So there's a lot of work to do between now and the point that we get to a democratic, then a unified North Korea. But I will say that this president, this administration, has gone way beyond what you have seen before. And I think the seriousness of this is important as we look at the fact that he decided to step back until we can have a truly complete, verifiable, denuclearized North Korea. You need to start stepping back and then coming back together again. But I think there's too great of a gap between the North and the United States right now to have had that meeting specifically at this time.
You know, let's talk about another process, something that you in your past jobs, let's call it that, has been more familiar with, Bill, and that is how we verify actions when it comes to, say, the destruction of tunnels and facilities, nuclear, chemical, biological. What should that process look like?
Sure, there is a verification process, and it has been set up for a very long time, and we did it when we were working with the former Soviet Union as those nuclear weapons were removed. If you look at START Treaty and many others, and we started reducing the nuclear weapons on both sides in that particular case. But as those were reduced, there was a very specific and technical inspection criteria that said not only are you going to show an explosion that maybe blew something up, but you're actually going to go down and inspect the facility prior to and after the event. And blowing up tunnels, et cetera, is not always the best way to remove a capability. You need to know where the fissile material is. You need to know where the technology is. You need to know where the launch capability is. So there's much more there than just blowing up a tunnel.
Can South Korea play a role in this? Obviously, they're the neighbor, and of course the neighbor on the other side is China. But South Korea, our close ally, President Moon and his administration, what role, if any, can they play in monitoring, in being the verification partner, if that's the right term for this?
Yeah, well, a bigger statement I would say is that it's not just South Korea, but it's South Korea, it's Japan, it's Russia, it's China, can all play a role in the overall stability. But when we're talking about verification in particular, of course, those in the local area, whether it's South Korea or Japan in particular, are very close friends and allies, can certainly help with that verification. And they have a lot of that capability inherent to their own countries, and working with the United States would allow that to happen just because we have the local access from them, as well as the technological capability of both of those countries. And then working with the United States, we can do a lot of verification.
My guest, Dr. William Parker, I call him Bill, COO of the East-West Institute, their website, eastwest.ngo. And, of course, Bill, you follow, and I want to put aside the politics of this. Unfortunately, we can never remove the politics. It's political leadership. But the focus on a process here that leads us forward includes culture, and we've talked about it before. In your observation of this developing or maybe ongoing situation between North Korea, South Korea, us, China, and all the other actors involved, in North Korea, is there any apparent change in the culture that could drive some of this change? Is there a recognition? Is there more information to what was once called and still is to some degree the hidden kingdom?
The hidden kingdom still exists. There's no doubt about that. But there is more information getting into the country now due to great efforts by this administration and previous administrations in trying to communicate more with the population. But there's still a frustration there for sure, and it will be something that will take decades to communicate appropriately. And it's not just communicating the message, but it's having people actually believe that message, because we see stuff all the time in our media and media around the world that we hear but we don't believe. So having them believe is just as important, and the only way you're going to do that is to, quote, put your money where your mouth is, and that means when people start eating better, when people are healthier, when they can travel outside their country and they see others traveling into their country, that is the real strategic communication message that needs to happen in order for this communication capability to work properly.
Add into that communication, and of course, as I have interviewed others who've left that country through, shall we say, harsh circumstance and, travels that we can't imagine, there is also the reunification aspect culturally, not reunification as we see down the road, but of families that talk to each other. Is there communication in any form through the black market between South and North Koreans? There is some travel daily for work that we don't often talk about, and it's very limited, but is there any other form? Because one seed planted can begin to grow.
The short answer is yes. There's lots of communication going on, not enough. And again, not enough believing from either side of what's happening on the other. But we're certainly heading in that direction. There is a lot of communication going on in a lot of different ways.
If you were advising this White House and they were to say, Bill, come on down, give us your input, what would you say is probably the first or maybe a couple of next steps? Put in the politics, and you're going to have to not put it aside, but you're going to have to factor in the politics, because North Korea observes what goes on here.
I would, number one, sit down in a closed-door session with our own politicians and lay out for them some of the details and make it clear that if those are let out, that it actually has a negative impact on the United States, on our security. And I'd be very careful on how much I would let out as the process went on.
Unfortunately, politics plays into that.
I'm sorry, say that again?
I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, I was saying unfortunately because, to your point, the politics of leak and statements plays into it.
That's absolutely right, and it's certainly a frustration, not just for this president, but previous presidents as well. Secondly, I would start working, and I would continue to work very closely with the Chinese, but also with Japan and with South Korea, as this administration has been doing. It is not lost on anybody that a combat operation of any sort in or on the peninsula has massive impact on the economy of China in particular. China could be the big loser on this if there is no good outcome. In other words, if there is combat, China will be the big loser economically. And if China is a big loser economically, it impacts the rest of the globe. So it is in their best interest to ensure that we have a peaceful resolution to this. Next, I would be very careful on what a post-nuclear North Korea looks like, whether or not they are closer to South Korea, Japan, and the United States, or whether they are closer to China or Russia. And I think that's very important. So that's something that I would be looking at very carefully as we proceed forward here.
Well, we have a long way to go, and I'm sure we'll have many more discussions, you and I, on this. And the world is watching this because the world is in play in many ways, economically, security-wise, and others. Final question for you, Bill, and that is one of the instruments that you talk about, the instruments of national power, the law enforcement aspect of this. North Korea engages in a great deal of illegal behavior, counterfeiting, cyber, and others. Can we do more? And given the fact that cybercom here in the United States has been moved under, under a different structure within the Pentagon, should we move forward more aggressively on that front?
Yeah, we're being pretty aggressive as a country in a good way on this. We're also tying in the efforts that are being made by the Secretary of the Treasury and through OFAC and others to ensure that those individuals that are trading what they shouldn't be trading with North Korea, that are importing what they shouldn't be importing, that are exporting money to put in accounts outside of theirs are properly and appropriately dealt with. And so that's one area where law enforcement and Treasury together and cyber are doing a really pretty spectacular job of combining these efforts to ensure that we get to the point where it's putting that term maximum pressure on North Korea. And I think that maximum pressure will continue, and I think it's been successful to date. But it's very important that as we put that pressure on, that we don't fall for the bright, shiny object, which others have in the past. And this president, to his great credit, has said, I'm not falling for that. It's not the right time to have this meeting based on things that you have not done that you said you were going to do up to this point. So that continuous stream of lies is being called out. We continue to do the pressure, but at the same time, diplomatically, even in the president's letter, he leaves enough opening there for this meeting to occur and for denuclearization to happen.
My guest, Dr. Bill Parker, COO of the East-West Institute at eastwest.ngo. The journalist's easy question, Bill, as we wrap up is, okay, so is there something I didn't ask you? I leave that open to you, my friend.
I don't think there's anything you haven't asked me, but I will just go back to say that I think the economic pressure tied with the diplomatic efforts that have been going on. A lot of people say we weren't doing diplomacy. Then all of a sudden they found out that we've been sending Pompeo quietly over there, who did a very good job in those early meetings, that we've had other very senior people, government and non-government people, talking to the North Koreans, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese, et cetera, that's been happening. I think it's important to understand that there is a lot of work that's been happening and that we have to continue this maximum pressure campaign to get to the point where removing those nuclear weapons is really the only reasonable option for that individual. And that Kim Jong-un knows that he's not going to end up hung in the streets if he does what we ask him to do.
Well, I think we'll leave it at that for today, and we'll probably be back next week. I have a feeling that maybe for the next decade, you and I will be talking about this as it develops, as it moves forward in some fashion. Bill, always a pleasure.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you. Have a great day.
Dr. Bill Parker, COO of the East-West Institute, their website, eastwest.ngo. You can also follow him on Twitter at William J. Parker. And I right after that. I think that's the third. We'll have to double check on that, guys. Make sure we get that typo handled. Or EW Institute for East-West Institute. 866-95-PATRIOT, 957-2874. Don, Louisiana. Go ahead.